Okay, so we're going to work on this hinge today. The goal today is to get this pin out of the top of the hinge. And you can see from the replacement part that we have, it's pressed into the hole, but there's no access from the bottom to put something in through the hinge and press it out. And you can't clamp it into something and try and hammer it out. We tried that, that's not really going to work. So we're going to make a little fixture that's going to help us try and pull this pin out of this hole. So the first thing we have to do is you want to measure the diameter of this pin. If you don't know what the diameter is, it's 3/8 of an inch, but we have this dial micrometer that you can use to put on here. And the way these things work, you put it around the body of the pin. There's a little fine control here which clicks when it gets tight enough. You lock it, you take it off, and you read the size. And I can tell you, I've already read this one, it's 3/8 of an inch. So I know that the pin diameter is 3/8 of an inch. So what I need to do is make something that I can fit around the body of the pin, smaller than the head of the pin, that I can use to then draw this pin out of the hole. And what we're going to do is we're going to take a couple of pieces of flat bar. This is a 1/4 inch thick by, what's that say, 1.25 inches wide, flat bar. We bought at Lowe's. And I'm going to take 2 pieces of it. This first piece we're going to put basically like this against the pin. The second piece on this side of the pin. And we're actually going to drill a hole right in the middle of it so that the 2 halves will then go around the body of the pin and then grab the head of the pin. And then we're going to weld them together once we get that hole drilled. After that's on, or actually before we put it on, we're also going to drill 2 more holes into the sides or the ends of this piece. And we're going to weld some nuts onto the top, put a couple of bolts in there. Then you'll be able to tighten the bolts, and as you tighten the bolts, that'll raise up this little piece, whatever you want to call it, this little tool, and it will be prying against the head of the pin and pushing down on the hinge, and hopefully it'll pop right out. I put some penetrating oil on this thing a while ago and let that soak in. We're going to crack it in the head with a mallet in a minute just to try and loosen up the pin. We might even heat it up a little bit just to try and loosen things up first. So the first step is to mark the center of these 2 plates and then take it over to the drill press. We want to drill a hole right in the middle here, so we're going to just put a couple of tack welds on it to hold it, drill a hole. I think I got a 7/16 inch drill bit, so they got a little bit of clearance to go around the pin. But then we'll cut the tack welds, separate the 2 pieces, put them back, measure where we want to drill the holes for the bolts, drill those 2 holes, weld on the nuts, and then put it around the pin, weld it nice and good. We might even weld on a stiffener piece, and then start cranking on the bolts and see what happens. So the first step is to drill the hole for the pin after we tack weld these things together. We tack welded the 2 halves of this plate together. Then we took it over to a drill press and drilled the 7/16 inch diameter hole right in the middle of the 2 halves. So now we can cut these tack welds off, and we'll be able to take the 2 pieces and put them on around the bolt. You see right now, obviously, it's not going to go on. So we'll take it apart, put it on around the bolt, and then figure out where I want to drill the holes for the 2 bolts that we're going to use to actually tighten up and screw this piece out with. Alright, so here's another intermediate step. We have split the 2 halves by grinding off the tack welds. So now you can see that what we're going to do is take these 2 halves. Now I can put them around the bolt. Then we can weld them back together. But the first thing I want to do is just temporarily tape them together so that they stay aligned, and figure out where I need to drill the 2 holes for the jacking screws that are going to go down and help me. Well, they're actually going to do all the work. So we got to figure out where to put the jacking screws. Okay, so here's the next step. We've drilled the 2 holes in the bracket for the bolts that we're going to put on. So the next thing that we will do is we will join these 2 pieces on the hinge and then weld this joint. You know, and this is the sort of the throwaway aspect of this tool, is because now we have to weld it on here. So it's going to be like a one-time use. And then we'll be able to weld the nuts over the holes and then put the screws in and hopefully tighten up those screws and pull this stud out of the hinge. All right, so before we actually weld the 2 halves of the bars together, we're going to weld the nuts onto the top. And the way that we're going to make sure that the nuts are positioned where we want them is we've temporarily just ran the bolts through the holes and then put 2 nuts on each side. So we'll tack weld the nuts on and take the bolts and the bottom nuts off, weld them on, and that way we know that our nuts are centered over our holes. Okay, so here's the finished product. I have the plate. It's been welded. The 2 halves have been welded. Here's the stud that's on the hinge. I have the 2 bolts installed. Now you can see it's a little loose right now, but the object is to tighten up these 2 bolts and pry out this stud. I think I'm going to take a washer or some kind of a thick, probably a big washer or something, and put it down in here underneath this plate on top of the hinge so that it doesn't get twisted sideways, it doesn't get cocked sideways when we start to tighten it up. But really, I think it's ready now to put in the vise and start tightening these bolts and see if we can't get this stud to pop out of the hinge. A couple of things that we learned when we were doing this. The welds on top, joining these 2 plates together, are really terrible, and that was because we used bare wire and shielding gas, which is really made for sheet metal, and we turned it up to the recommended thicknesses for 1/4-inch steel, but it didn't really work as nicely. We switched the welder over to the flux core wire, which doesn't require any shielding gas because it's already got the flux in the wire. And the welds on the back, you can see we did those with the flux core, and those are beautiful. So when you're welding thick steel like this, 1/4-inch thick pieces, use a flux core wire. Don't use bare wire and shielding gas. One last thing, when we welded on the back side, we got a little bit of that weld bead just over the edge of the hole, and when we first ran the bolts in to the holes, the weld bead wiped out the threads on the bolts, and then for some reason when we took the bolts out back through the nuts, it kind of messed up the thread in the nuts. So I just got a tap and tapped the nuts again and went all the way through and actually tapped the little bit of the weld bead that is in the hole, and now, you know, I can run these in by hand. The bolts run in and out of the holes, no problem. Here it is, all clamped up in the vise. Now I'm ready to start turning these bolts and hopefully pulling this stud out of the hinge. So let's see how it works. First we'll just tighten them up a little bit so it doesn't move. And you want to try and keep it even. You don't want to bend. Alright, so you want to keep it even. You don't want to bend the stud and crack it off inside the hinge. Now what's happening on the back side here, you can't really see it, but this thing is, it's tipping a little bit towards the back. And I had a shim put in there, but now the shim is really not tall enough. So I'm hoping that this is actually pulling the pin out. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to lower it now and give myself enough room to put in. That's the shim that fell out. A thicker shim back here. And if I take a look underneath this thing, it's actually, yeah, it's working, it's coming out. So we'll just keep working on it, keep cranking away. I'm going to put, this was just a little flat piece of steel. I have some other ones of different thicknesses. I'm just going to stick those in underneath this other corner in the back here to stop this jig from rotating. So let's keep going. Whoops. You know, and resist the temptation just to try and crank it all the way out, all in one shot. You know, you gotta just keep an eye on what you're doing. And the shim fell out again. But that's okay. Alrighty. Batteries died, so I had to switch to a different camera. That's why it might look a little different. But I'm almost done here, so I didn't want to have to wait a whole nother day to finish. The shims really are necessary here on this thing to keep it from getting crooked. So I just keep packing them in. Almost out. You can see how tall the pin is above the top of the hinge and the withdrawal plate. Alright, this should be it. Just had to repack the shims in. You can see it gets quite crooked if you don't have that thing shimmed properly. Which is what's happening right now. Shims need to be a lot taller. Here it is, it's out. Just did the last little bit by pulling it up by hand. Here's the pin. Alright, so here it is. You can see the pin has been removed. This is a hole that it goes in. You might not be able to see, but this hole has little ridges in it that match the grooves on the pin. So when you put the new one in, I'm going to try and at least rotate the new one so that the ridges on the pin line up with the grooves in the hinge. So the next step is to clean this one up a little bit and then rebuild it using all of the new pieces.